Welcome to Rebuilding the Republic, conversations about America's future here at the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director. Today's conversation is a partnership with our friends and longtime collaborators in UAlbany's Department of History. We'll be talking about the multicultural foundations of American society and the implications for our multicultural future. We're thrilled to be here with Sharada Balachandran Orihuela, author of Fugitives, Smugglers, and Thieves, Piracy and Personhood in American Literature, a book that investigates the multiracial and multicultural world of pirates, escaped slaves, counterfeiters, illegal migrants, and black market traders as they are portrayed in 18th and 19th century American writings. A member of a large multiracial and multicultural family, and first cousin to Vice President Kamala Harris, Sharada Balachandran Orihuela brings a fascinating perspective to her scholarship. You can read more about her and the book here on this page. You can also purchase a copy of the book via a link to an independent bookstore here on this screen. With us today to lead the conversation is Dr. Christopher Pastore, Undergraduate Director of the UAlbany History Department. Dr. Pastore is a social and cultural historian of early America and the Atlantic world, and the author of the book Between Land and Sea, the Atlantic Coast, and the Transformation of New England. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, and thanks for having me. Sharada, I'm really excited to talk about your book today because I absolutely loved it, and so I've got some questions for you, and
Yes.
you can take these questions in any direction you'd like. But just to start off, Fugitives, Smugglers, and Thieves: Piracy and Personhood in American Literature. Now, most scholarship has described piracy as something that's inimical to the orderly operations of states. Okay, pirates were outlaws who, for all intents and purposes, wrought havoc on traditional channels of power. But you describe piracy as something very different from this. So, can you just tell us how do you define piracy?
Well, that is my starting point, Chris. Can I call you Chris?
Yeah, absolutely.
That is my starting point, to think of the pirate as an inimical figure to the nation state and to civil society itself. In certain texts, a pirate is described as the enemy of all nations, and the enemy of all. So I really take the pirate's position as a kind of inimical figure as a starting point for the book, to rethink how pirates, abide by a particular social order that in part is invested in, and I use that word deliberately, in making possession possible for dispossessed populations. While the book isn't in and of itself about what I call our pirates, with this sort of like peg leg and, the Jolly Roger flying on the ship, I do take the pirate as a figure that looms large in a national and cultural imaginary, as a figure that is really assaulting the legitimacy and integrity and power of the state, and making possession possible for populations that are excluded from the regime of property ownership. And that's sort of the starting point for the book in and of itself. So I really do like thinking about the pirate as a figure that's really upsetting the way and the way we do things and the order of things. And that, to me, is a really potentially very productive and fertile position to start with.
Yeah, yeah. So in your estimation, then, why have, who are pirates then? Who are they? So can you kind of zero in on some of the people who engage in your version of piracy, or how you're imagining piracy?
Yeah, so in taking sort of this broader definition of piracy, again, not just thinking about it as a kind of maritime extra legal activity, but also expanding it to land and thinking about how, there are different kinds of possessory or property behaviors that, similar to piracy, also assault the legitimacy and integrity and power of the state to delegate who can and cannot become a propertied person. I look at, by using this particular framework, I'm able to look at enslaved populations, landed populations living along the US-Mexico borderlands during the Mexican-American War. I look at the figure of the pirate in early American literature and works by James Fenimore Cooper, who is, part of what we think of when we think of American literary nationalism. And then my last chapter in the book looks at blockade runners during the Civil War. So I'm able to look, and I also look at counterfeiters through this particular lens. Again, because counterfeiters, we can talk about this later on, but the way I see counterfeiters in the early 19th century is as a population, it's a group of people that are actually expanding the circulation of money, really, and that are making this kind of exchange possible on which the nascent US nation state relies.
Okay, yeah. Now, I want to ask you a couple more questions about the premise of your book, and then I want to kind of maybe ask you a few more questions about how you came to this topic. But before we get to that, you mentioned just in your last response this idea of property and property kind of as a source of rights, and property as something that dispossessed groups are trying to acquire to gain rights. And maybe you can just kind of set the groundwork for us. Like, how is property a source of rights? And in other words, how does it guarantee membership in like the state, or how does it guarantee membership in the collective, if you will?
That is such a long and it's going to take a while to explain it, and I don't want to, it's a complicated answer at the very least. I started with the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which appears several times in the US Constitution. And as we perhaps know, that is an iteration of John Locke's belief in life, liberty, and property. And so I found it very interesting that property becomes substituted with the pursuit of happiness in its iteration on the American continent. And so I wondered, what is the place of property in the creation of the US nation state and its ideas of citizenship? And there's several ways to answer this particular question about why property matters. To some degree, it is based on these kind of foundational liberal principles about the importance of self-possession in a kind of liberal imaginary, that to think of oneself as a liberal subject, as someone able to participate in this kind of new forms of civil society, that we are entitled to, at some foundational level, to the possession of the self. And so to frame that as an act of property ownership, I think is very interesting. And you can see how that matters then in the case of enslaved persons in the antebellum period. Enslaved persons don't have right to the property of their own bodies. And that's where I see sort of these radical acts of piracy taking place in, for example, the works I look at are the novel Blake by Martin Delany, not Samuel Delany, and then some slave narratives. And there, it seems to me what I kept seeing was this importance placed on self-possession, the importance placed on owning the body and the self, because of course you are completely stripped of that right to possession. And so it was really about sort of linking Locke and thinking about this particular subject position that enslaved persons share in an antebellum period, and trying to sort of connect these two ideas or these two concepts, looking at a variety of different documents and texts. So the book, as you know, at this point, assembles or marshals a number of different kinds of texts to examine how property is imagined in the late 18th and 19th centuries. So I look at several Supreme Court cases, for example, or in one instance, I look at the deliberations of the Wisconsin Convention at the beginning, at the initial stages of the state's creation, to see how they thought about the citizen. And it was very interesting to me that something they deliberated was, well, what do we do with our citizen and their rights to property? And so these conversations just kept appearing in the texts I was examining, and really it was very difficult to then narrow the number of different texts that I was going to examine for the purposes of this book. Because once you start seeing these kinds of acts of property ownership or of possession, you start seeing them everywhere. And so it was really about sort of figuring out how to tell a particular story in moments where the word property emerges in American legal thought, in American jurisprudence, and trying to figure out how that relates to what different writers are representing in their narratives or in their novels. And the term property, of course, and the concept of property ownership extends to how we think about rights in an American context. So we think of rights as a possession. So you're stripped of rights, or you're given rights. So rights are something that we very much think of in propertied terms. And so this concept of rights really does become sutured to the question of property. And so property just looms large, I think, in the American imaginary. And so it's not surprising that, you know, in the 14th Amendment, that you have the resurgence of the term property right when you're starting to think about the rights of citizens, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that wasn't a super convoluted way to answer that question. It's just, it's these sort of very tenuous kinds of threads that I attempted to weave together into this story, the fabric of this story.
Yeah, and you know, but what's fascinating about the story is how in trying to, how in all these different groups in different ways trying to secure property, acquire property, often through what we'd consider extra legal channels, as a means, or at least it's at some level shaping the conversation about citizenship. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of and talk a little bit about that, as property ownership as a foundation of American citizenship.
Property ownership is the foundation of American citizenship. Well, I think I would go back to what I just mentioned, which is that when we think about rights as a kind of property, and then we think of citizenship as a particular bundle of rights that were given by the nation state, then the question is, what is the place of property, not just as a kind of as a symbol of citizenship, but as an actual material for citizenship. And so to do that work, you sort of have to work backwards. So for example, you know, my work is very much indebted to Black feminist scholarship that attempts to engage in a process of sort of discovery and recovery, and looking at what is absent, this kind of suspicious reading, or the paranoid reading, as much looking for what's absent as much as what's present. And so, you know, there's this instance, for example, this case that we see deliberated, where in the antebellum period, where a case titled or called Heron v. Brillo. And in this particular case, a Black woman was asking for the rights to the kind of material possessions of the white man that she lived with. And we don't know very much about this woman, as you can imagine. What we do know is that ultimately she was denied the rights to the property of her partner, I guess you could say, like in sort of using very kind of like modern language, because Black people were not entitled to property. So I think that one of the kind of foundational shifts that you see, you know, that you see happen after the end of the Civil War is that Black people are afforded the rights to property, including the possession of themselves and their own bodies. And so that's sort of a way to sort of work backward and see on what grounds at different moments the courts used to deprive, for example, Black people of property, or what language was used to dispossess these kind of wealthy landed Mexicans living in the US-Mexico borderlands. And in part, the language used suggests that because these persons it's a very tautological argument that happens in certain instances, because these persons are now dispossessed of their property, it is questionable whether they can become full citizens of the US nation state, or become members, in this particular instance, members of the US nation state. And so the act of dispossession actually is anticipates the dispossession of citizenship later on that is to come. And so it's a bit of sort of working backwards to see sort of the moments where dispossession happens, and to examine the logic used in order to dispossess these persons, and trying to figure out, well, how is this language engaging with a certain kind of discourse over property, or discourse of property and possession.
Yeah. Maybe in the spirit of working backwards, can you tell us about how did you come to this topic? I mean, you come from, I read some interviews about you. You come from a very multicultural family. In one interview, you said you had a globe-trotting childhood, and you've got a very famous cousin, right? Vice President Kamala Harris. Can you just tell us a little bit about how this perhaps globe-trotting childhood and maybe shaped some of your thinking in creating this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just far less romantic than it sounds. I mean, my parents, I have a parent who's Indian and a parent who is Mexican, and they still live in India and in Mexico. And so we moved around a lot, simply because my parents were committed in some way to me growing up where they had grown up, and to get to know my grandparents, and on both sides of my family, and my cousins and my aunts and uncles, etc. For me as a child, it was, it's not a super fun thing to start school over, 6 times before you start college, or I don't even know, I lost track of how many times we moved really before I came to college here in the US. So I don't know that that is as much or has as big a role to play in the creation of this book, as much as my immigration to the United States had to play with it. And I would say that I just recently, this past fall, finally became a permanent resident. Up until this past fall, I'd been on a series of either student visas or work visas since 2001, which is when I moved to the United States. And that year, of course, looms large also in the American imaginary. I moved here 2 weeks before 9/11, and my college orientation was to take place on September 11th of 2001, and it was, delayed, and we sort of didn't start school until late September, I think, that year. And at that particular moment, my position shifted so radically. I think as part Indian, like an Indian woman, and being Indian American and somewhere being registered as South Asian, in many ways always positions you as someone aligned with the model minority. And all of a sudden that changed so dramatically that now my body was seen as a source of anxiety and threat to the US nation state. And I would say that moment really made me acutely aware of sort of my position and feeling, relatively speaking, I'm speaking from a position of privilege, but it's feeling very othered in ways that my presence was a point of fear or terror to sort of like the state. And so that, I think, really animated some of my interest in this kind of these inimical figures, and also on my interest in figures that are sort of neither fully citizens but also present. What do we do with figures that aren't, haven't been given the full bundle of rights and privileges attached to US citizenship, but that are still present and whose bodies are the source of extreme anxiety and fear and terror. What do we do with this particular, subject position? And I think the figures I examine in this book are very much figures that resonate with this kind of position, the subject position that I inhabited in the aftermath of 9/11, of being kind of outside and othered, and at the drop of a hat, potentially stripped of all of my, all of my rights. I was extremely fearful, for example, when Trump was president, and the way in which he revoked student visas, for example, to think that so quickly you can be cast out. That really animated my interest in questions of citizenship and questions of belonging, and what we do with figures that don't fit neatly into a particular narrative or story of the nation state.
Yeah. So following up on that, you went to Mills College in Oakland, California, and then you went on to do a PhD at UC Davis, right? And
that's correct.
How did you take these ideas that are kind of simmering, right? That from all the way from 2001, they're simmering, and then perhaps even highlighted in sharp relief with Trump, but they're probably a whole bunch of mixed emotions. How do you channel that into something so focused and methodical as a book? How did you end up taking these again feelings and then articulating them through in a scholarly way? How did you do that?
That's a great question. I mean, the easy answer is that it took me 12 years to do that. I think when I started college, I was immediately drawn to my literature courses, and I had the great privilege of being taught at Mills by a lot of amazing BIPOC professors. And so from the very beginning, I knew that literature was a very rich resource for a number of different things, including the way in which mining literature can actually give us a sense of what's happening at a particular period in American history. And so I was just immediately drawn to literature, and I just read, and I read widely. And when I started graduate school, I started with the intention of doing a comparative project on post-colonial literature and African-American literature. And it just so happened that in graduate school, advisors left, new faculty came in, and, as a graduate student, you're subject to the vagaries of these shifts in academia. And all of a sudden I found myself working with professors who were very interesting questions of, citizenship, the nation state, thinking about power. And so I just read and read and read, but it took me a long time to be able to distill these varied interests into one project. And I will say that my dissertation is very much partly a 20th century American literature project. And when I started writing this book, once it came time to turn the dissertation into a book, I realized I just needed to go further back in time in order to really fully flesh out this question of citizenship. When do we see citizenship emerge? We have this idea of like a national citizenship as having always existed and being kind of ubiquitous, but it's a relatively new phenomenon that emerges with the end of the Civil War, when we need a kind of national citizen to unite this kind of fractured nation state. And so it took me sort of to this post-revolutionary period, where then I started doing a lot of reading in late 18th and early 19th century US literature. So I will say it took me a very long time to do this focus thing, but I still, of course, the minute you publish this book, you're like, oh, it's full of things. Like, I wish I'd done it entirely differently, but it took me a long time to do that.
Oh, I'm glad you didn't do it differently. I guess just as a follow-up to that, one of the things that so impressed me about the book is that you're able to take these big ideas about property and citizenship, but then you're able to channel those big ideas through these wonderful characters and these novels and other memoirs and other types of books, these texts that are able to show these big ideas. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you homed in on those texts that ended up getting into the book. I'm sure you read many more, but how did you choose those? And maybe there's a few characters that stuck out to me particularly, and one is the counterfeiter Stephen Burrows, and I really loved that story. And so maybe you could tell us about how you started to, again, home in on the text, but then maybe tell us a little bit about Burrows as well.
Burrows is such an interesting figure. I mean, the way I stumbled on Burrows was really through conversations with friends and colleagues. And I think so much of how we come across these works is completely in this kind of accidental fashion. And the memoir of Stephen Burrows is one example of that, where I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine. At the time, I was completing my dissertation at Kenyon College, and this colleague of mine said, "Oh my God, you have to read Stephen Burrows's memoir. I mean, it's full of these rich representations of the circulation of currency, in the post-revolutionary period." And of course, you read this text, and he is just, of course, as a literary critic, there's so much to do with a text like this. I mean, one, we can think of his own self-fashioning, and he sort of represents himself as this very sort of like scampish rogue, who is like uncontainable, that he is sort of almost pathologically drawn to counterfeiting. He can't stop himself, from breaking the law. But also pair that with, I think at moments some serious treatments of why currency and its circulation is so important to sort of these post-revolutionary Americans. And certainly I think the way I think about Stephen Burrows is that he attempts to, and I use this term deliberately in the book, forge, as in to counterfeit, but also to create a kind of a propertied homo economicus of the early, I'm using this, this kind of term associated with neoliberalism, but positioning him in the early 19th century, this kind of propertied subject who's able to exchange, goods for currency in a marketplace, and that becomes a kind of expression or a fulfillment of a kind of early American sense of personhood. And so so you have to sort of, it's so interesting to have to read Burrows, and you still have to kind of dig through, like his, like the sheer joy that he has in describing at times, like all of the trouble that he gets in, and then try to unearth from that, these moments where he does have these kind of like extended discussions about the importance and the value of currency, not currency in and of itself, but the potential, the possibility that the circulation of currency presents to early Americans.
Yeah, and you even suggest that at some level, this circulation of counterfeit currency almost creates an elevated information literacy, that people start to be more careful readers and paying attention a little bit more because of counterfeiting.
Absolutely. I mean, most of the money circulating in the early 19th century was counterfeit because there was no sort of national banking system and no national currency yet. That comes about with the end of the Civil War. So again, a moment where you see the rise of currency coincide with the rise of the citizen, the national currency and national citizenship. I don't think that's just coincidence, right? I think there's something happening there where, again, the United States is trying to sort of to fix this fracture, and doing so with currency and with the creation of kind of national citizenship is foundational to that. But before that, in a time of like sort of rampant counterfeiting and the establishment of these small banks that printed their own currency, but then would go under or would close, and all of a sudden your currency means nothing. Early Americans had to sort of sit and kind of parse out whose money they could trust, and parse out if the currency seemed legitimate to them. So there were these like sort of registers that would be printed and circulated where you could sort of take your like multiple banknotes and sort of figure out if they're still like sort of in use, if they're legitimate or counterfeit. And that too promotes a certain kind of literacy, a kind of financial literacy. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the literacy works on several registers. Like you have to know, one, you're sort of comparing your own banknotes to those printed in these kind of registers to see if they're legitimate, but also coming to understand or think through whom you could trust to exchange, with, based on whether you could trust their banknotes.
Yeah, yeah. What was your favorite source that you found?
Oh, well, my favorite has always been Martin Delaney's Blake. I mean, that's a text that I read fairly early on in graduate school. And I fell in love with that novel. I mean, I think Martin Delany is just a wonderful example of, this the kind of what am I trying to say? I mean, Martin Delany is this figure who just does so much. I mean, he's a foundational thinker, I think, in 19th century Black thought, but also, the number of different texts that he writes is an example, and the volume of text is an example of just this kind of the very nuanced ways in which 19th century Black persons are attempting to sort of understand their position in the nation state. And I think Martin Delany is one of those kind of foundational thinkers. And Blake is just this marvelous text that begins in the United States, but travels all through the South with this figure Blake fomenting insurrection and rebellions everywhere he goes. And then he finally ends up in Cuba, and in this twist, we realize that Blake is actually Cuban and part of a kind of nascent independence movement there, and very much interested in the emancipation of Black people across the Americas, in the Caribbean, and in the United States. And so I just find him, Blake, to be just this very incredibly powerful figure, similar to how I think of Martin Delany, but that Blake goes around and just incites enslaved people to run away, to escape, and to, in this way, through this act of fugitivity, claim their own bodies. I just think it's just so marvelous, because Martin Delany has no interest in this kind of respectability in any way, right? That his hero is someone who's going around telling other enslaved people to rebel, to escape by any means possible. I think is just so marvelous in this period.
Yeah. That was one of my favorite parts of your book, and just the idea of fugitivity as being part of this piracy, if you will, a form of claiming membership, claiming ownership of one's own property, of taking it back again. It was this. I was really impressed by your reading of that.
And then once you see it there, you see it in a number of different texts written in this period, where all of a sudden this kind of the body, and we know this from having, taken our 19th century US Lit courses, or having read a number of different slave narratives, for example, but the body is so foundational to thinking about freedom, and to have that animated in Blake, who's then telling everyone to own their own bodies and to run away as an expression of ownership, is just really powerful to me.
Yeah. So if you were to take what you've done here, right? And if you were to say, grab the ear of some high-ranking government official, perhaps someone who had the power to affect policy, based on your research, what kind of advice might you have? What would you say?
Oh, that is such a big question, so loaded. I don't know exactly how to answer that. I mean, I think the way I think about literature is that it offers us alternatives and imagined outcomes that are not quite realizable in the world that we inhabit. And so for me, literature just holds a very special place, because to me, it is an expression of a speculative, potentially better future. And so, and the way I think about politics is not necessarily that way. I don't see it necessarily as I shouldn't say that. I don't know that I think the American political system right now is, it seems more fractured than ever before. And in fact, it's so interesting that we're doing this today in DC when there was another planned sort of assault on the Capitol. And so to me, like what literature offers us is a way to imagine something different, to imagine an alternative to the world that we inhabit. And I think in its most idealistic state, I think law does that too, right? And I think as politicians, as the kind of sources in many instances of law, that law offers us a potential to see things very differently. So I think there is that kind of through line. To grab the ear of a politician and to speak something that would be so profound feels completely, feels so distant, from my reality. I guess I think the importance of sort of the text and close reading and to engage with these materials in a substantive way is all I can ask for. And I think that is my sort of goal as a professor too, is to create thoughtful readers. And I think it is through reading that we really can come to understand something deeper than what is just presented on the surface. So I don't know what I would say. Read more. I don't know.
I'm gonna push you one, maybe I'll just come at it from a different angle. So if pirates, or we'll go back to pirates, if pirates are simply seeking, say, state recognition, right, or membership, belonging, and maybe even some semblance of equity, what must a just society do to make an honest person of a pirate?
Well, I think that is also where literature comes in, and is that literature offers us the potential to imagine a nation state or a society where everyone is given equal access to membership within a community and all the rights and resources that are attached with that particular membership. And so in this way, perhaps it is a little bit sort of utopic. And so I would say, yeah, literature offers us this kind of world where we can locate representations of a society that dispenses rights and resources equally. However, as critics and as scholars and intellectuals, we know that in some way is impossible, right? Because the nation state always relies on an inside and an outside. And so, the book ends with linking the pirate to the terrorist, for example. In what world could we imagine the terrorist being incorporated as a kind of lawful citizen or as a rights-bearing subject? And in that world, we would just have to find another outside or beyond that particular bounded category. So, in the Trump years, the terrorist was transmuted into, the bad hombres and the illegal immigrants, and so so what I would say is there's always an outside. And I think that's the kind of uncomfortable reality for me as a scholar. Literature gives me a world where I can imagine that. However, I know that the nation state hasn't been structured to have an unbounded inside, that it must always have its limits. And that's what makes it a nation state, able to govern its citizens. And so, yeah, I think it's a very kind of bifurcated way of looking at the world, right? In literature, I see the possibilities and also always the critiques of the realities, right? Literature is such a reflection, in some instances even anticipates the kind of world that we inhabit. But in reality, I know the nation state is always going to have an outside, so that it can understand it's within. I mean, it's just sort of foundational to me. So yeah, there's always going to be some inimical figure through which we understand the lawful good citizen, really. It's always it's the pirate, it's the terrorist, it's the illegal immigrant. It can be any number of people and then in different moments they get incorporated, they get swept back in, they get incorporated back into the folds of the good citizen, the lawful citizen or whatever. But there's always it's always sort of a game of whack-a-mole, because it's always going to pop up somewhere else.
Yeah. So for aspiring writers who are trying to wrap their minds around this, who are trying to look to the past, whether through literature or through history, or looking to the past as an opportunity to make a better future, what kind of advice might you have? What kind of parting advice would you have?
To writers looking to represent a better future? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's on a lot of people's mind right now. And so what advice do you have to them?
I think also to read widely and expansively. And, you know, I would always, and as I do with anyone I speak to, always direct them back to the works of important literary critics like Saidiya Hartman, whose newer works are very much in this kind of belong to a kind of speculative genre almost, where it's criticism, but also, works of fabulation in this kind of genre she calls critical fabulation, where you take like scant pieces of a world in disarray, and then you attempt to kind of rebuild or imagine out from these kinds of traces and these marks left, and try to work out and imagine something from these materials that have been left behind. And I think that kind of work holds so much potential, because we don't want, I think oftentimes writers of color have been restricted, historically, to writing about abjection and oppression and discrimination. But I think writers also have this great potential to use the past in order to come up with a different future. But for that work, you really need to go to the past, and to the ways in which our present is a direct response to those particular traces and archives and historical moments. And so, yeah, I think like reading expansively and reading in critical and also imaginative works that use frameworks established by thinkers of color to come up with these rich descriptions of a world that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see. Well, I hope that wasn't too convoluted.
No, that was terrific. I really appreciate it. And Sharada Balachandran Orihuela, I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me. And this is I loved your book. It was wonderful. And so I hope many more people read it as well. And I hope we get to continue the conversation sometime again in the future.
Thank you so much. You were so kind to have read the book, and you're very kind in your assessment of it. So thank you so much.
The book is Fugitives, Smugglers, and Thieves. It's available for purchase from an indie bookstore via a link on this screen. Thanks so much, Sharada Balachandran Orihuela and Christopher Pastore. Let me remind you that this and all our author interviews are posted on the Writers Institute's YouTube channel, and you can find them at The Conversation on our website, nyswritersinstitute.org, Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you wish to support future programming like this, you can make a donation at our website. To our audience, thanks so much for tuning in. Be well.